privilege to introduce Bob Oken, who is producing today's events. This is the beginning of a long day with a tremendous program in the evening as well. For those of you that don't know Bob has served as the executive producer for both previously nationally televised concerts, America Salutes You and America Salutes You Guitar Legends. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education, interesting combination, and he's also head of NBC Universal's Washington, D.C. office for about 17 years. Bob is the CEO of the O Team and serves as the CEO as well of Thanks USA. It's a national nonprofit awarding post-secondary school scholarships to children and spouses of active duty military personnel. Thanks USA, this is pretty amazing, Bob, I didn't know this. Thanks USA has contributed more than $12 billion to military dependents for education. Thank you, and I turn this over.
I'm glad I wrote all that. So. Yeah, my wife is here. We're both in from the East Coast, in Washington, D.C. And as they say, we're from Washington. We're here to help you. But she takes a lot of credit for helping us with the charity from its inception. I'll get to that in a minute. I just wanted to welcome everybody. I come from a public policy background from my work in Washington. I actually work at the Department of Education under the George H.W. Bush administration, so this is a difficult time for the country, but that was a real privilege. But I come from a public policy background, and so as I got into this space of working with America Salutes You and doing these essentially concerts for cause, where we focus on brain and mental wellness, charities, and awareness, I felt it was really important that it just not be a one-off concert, and that even though we're doing it for television, it'll be aired all around the country as a one-hour holiday special on December 22nd. That it's very important to have some policy substance behind it. So, for example, last year we were in New York and we had the VA Secretary and several of his deputies there speaking to a group like this, and a number of the folks that were our sponsors and our beneficiary charities. And so this is an all-star panel here. And so the idea is that we're going to film this and make it available to each of the panelists over on the America Salutes You website. And then we're also doing a 2-hour stream version of the concert. So we'll have a 1-hour broadcast special coming out of the 2.5-hour concert tonight over at the Novo. With some of the great guitar legends. We had a great practice session yesterday that you might have seen on the news. And then we're going to integrate some of the discussion here into that 2-hour stream, and then obviously make available the entire discussion today. So, Catherine, thank you for filming this for us. And so, let me just give you one other moment about why we're doing this. So, as Marie was saying, we got into the veteran space through our family, with our 2 daughters, who came up with the idea that we needed to do more for our veterans. This is back in 2005 and 2006 when the war was not going well. And we had a neighbor that moved in, one of the first to be severely injured from an IED in 2003. We didn't know what IEDs were, but this was in Baghdad. So he had a daughter that was 8 years old. After 20-some-odd surgeries, I think, right, mostly down in Fort Sam Houston in Texas, and he moved in next door to us, and so he had an 8-year-old daughter, we had an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, we'd all walk to school together. So the notion that we need to do more to help veterans like that is where the idea for our charity called Thanks USA came from. And so between my work, working with the charity, and also my work at NBC, I was on the corporate side of NBC, not the creative side, for almost 17 years in Washington. I just thought it was really important for us to not forget those who are representing and serving our country. 17 years now after 9/11, and people tend to move on with their lives, which is understandable, but I wanted to structure something almost like what Jerry Lewis did. Everyone who remembers Jerry Lewis in terms of having an annualized event, that would be a fundraiser. And the idea is, you cover your costs, you get some entertainers, and you pick charities that are deserving, and then you try to put it on the air where the country can see it. So that's what America Salutes You is all about. We did Guitar Legends 1 last year in New York. Some of the great guitarists were here in LA, and couldn't be more excited. And so So the idea, though, is that the charities that are benefiting are in the mental and brain wellness space. And so some are veterans, charities, some are first responders, but it really spans the spectrum from autism to Alzheimer's and everything in between. And so that's why we have this distinguished group of panelists today. And so do I turn it over to Harold now? Harold, would you honor us as our MC?
I admire all of our panelists here today and welcome everybody. I'm really honored to be here. I was reading bios, on the internet, thank God for the internet. Sorry for the internet. And I'm just impressed of the work you guys are doing to help humanity. And I want to be inclusive in that word, humanity, and in particular veterans, children, the mentally ill, the unfortunate folks with stigma-labeled diseases like who you work with, Patrick, severe autism spectrum. And Marie and I have worked together for many years. I am honored. Thank you for asking me to do this. So I'm the senior director of the Music Cares Foundation. We are part of the Grammy organization. And I've been with them 20 years, and part of our mission is to educate the music community on the problems of addiction, mental health, various things that address the social problems that musicians face because they are for the most part, a contracted population. You have insurance. We were formed to help pay for medical expenses and dental and psychiatric and substance abuse. So pretty much that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. My heart is into it. This panel is going to be addressing mental illness and trauma. And, just a little bit of my story is that 3 years ago I was sleeping in my car wanting to kill myself. And, I know what it feels like. Years later, I worked on a psych ward, and I know every morning, Monday morning, I would come in from the weekend, and from the ER, we'd have a new census of people who were admitted to the psych unit with depression and suicidal ideation or suicide attempt. And every Monday morning, I was so grateful that I was able to sit down and talk to these folks about what it feels like and that there is hope. And I think that we're going to be talking about some of those strategies to increase the well-being of that community. And so without further ado, I want to just start introducing, now Marie introduced Dan. So let me talk a little bit about Dr. Marlene Wong. Now, Dr. Wong, I only have one card of Dr. Wong because she has been quoted so many times, so I just didn't know where to start. It's an honor having you here, by the way. Dr. Wong is the USC Clinical Professor of Social Work. She's a co-principal investigator for capacity building in military and connected schools. I guess it's working with children. You can discuss that later. Military families. Thank you. She's been identified by the White House as one of the preeminent experts on school crisis and recovery. And she's also been quoted as the architect of social safety programs in the country. And, I think I saw that you were noted working with Homeland Security, all of the things out of Columbine, the mass shootings, and the trauma that the children went through, I suppose, have a big thing to do with your career. And I just want to thank you for being here. You've also worked with the RAND Corporation down in Santa Monica, which is kind of scary. I've always thought the RAND Corporation were thought police. Anyway, our next guest is going to be Patrick. Patrick Dollar is the president and CEO of the Center Discovery. It's a nonprofit nationally known provider of educational, health, clinical, and residential services for children and adults with severe and complex disabilities and mental disorders, including a growing number of individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And welcome, Patrick. Thank you. I also looked on the internet. That center that you have is amazing. I would encourage anyone here to look them up, and what Patrick is doing is just phenomenal. Our next guest on this panel would be Dan Griffin. So Dan, thank you for being here. I want to just, if you would, Dan works with men and male masculinity. I'd like to know about what you in particular do. What are some of you're very focused on male masculinity and recovery. And I just wanted to, if you could just tell us how you got here briefly and how you started your career.
Probably first and foremost, I'm a man in long-term recovery, and so the process of looking at my own need to be a healthy man kind of put me right up against all the things I had learned about being a man. And so I lived in this culture. My dad was a working-class Irishman from New Jersey. He was also a brilliant research scientist for the U.S. government. And I grew up in an environment that said men don't cry, men don't ask for help, men are strong, men don't show weakness, men aren't vulnerable. And certainly for me, I got into recovery, I started going to therapy, and all of a sudden they were saying, hey Dan, we want you to ask for help, and we want you to learn how to cry, we want you to admit weakness, and we want you to be powerless, and we want you to see connection and intimacy as something other than sex. So that those two diametrically opposed schemata for living have been really the essence of the work I've done, and I believe that that contradiction is a deep emotional, spiritual dissonance that is often not recognized in the services we provide or the way we support men in recovery, and particularly as it relates to trauma and mental health.
So we have a lot in common there. Just want to let you know.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
And have Mimi Martinez McKay. And Mimi is, let me have my notes here, is the Deputy Director of Strategic Communications for the LA County Department of Mental Health. She's also been past, for the state of Texas, Deputy Director of the Mental Health and Substance Abuse Program. Is that correct?
So Chief of Staff and Director of Communications for Mental Health and Substance Abuse in the state of Texas.
And that is great. I think we met in
We did that back
That is just amazing. It's a small world. Welcome.
Thank you.
Back home. For those of you who don't know, the Department of Mental Health is the largest county operated mental health department in the country. They have an annual budget of approximately $2.4 billion. And they operate programs in more than 85 sites with contract providers across the county. It's a wonderful organization. I've worked with them for many years in the past, and it's great for you guys to be here. The mission, I just want to say this because I love the mission statement of this DMH, is to optimize the hope, well-being, and life trajectory of Los Angeles County's most vulnerable through access to care and resources that promote not only independence and personal recovery, but connectedness and community reintegration. And with that, I would like to maybe start with you, Mimi, and let me ask you, what are your responsibilities? Yeah, I know they're varied, but what do you do?
I guess in a nutshell, the public face of DMH. So everything that pertains to the way we do outreach to the communities, the way we do stakeholder engagement, the way we do everything both through virtual and traditional means of communication. So all of our web services, all of our campaigns, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about one of those a little bit later, and we're going to be doing doing lots of different campaigns throughout this coming years. But again, I started just 1 year ago in this capacity, having done a similar role for the state of Texas. And I came in under a visionary director for the Department of Mental Health. I'd only been with the department for 2 years. His name is John Sharon. And he worked for the VA, he's worked in the military space for a long time. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today because he has an amazing background on the military front. But in my own background, I came to this really from the entertainment community. I produced radio shows. I worked in Austin, Texas for Austin City Limits and South by Southwest. I did a lot with the intersection between culture and mental health, and that's a lot that I brought to this position now.
You find the work, or did the work find you?
I was actually ready to come home, for lots of different reasons, including in 2004, I don't know if you all are familiar with the Mental Health Services Act, which is also called here in California the Millionaire's Tax. 2004, a tax passed in the state that required anyone who made over $1 million for 1% of that funding to go to mental health. That's created $14 billion since that passed. When I saw that, that was right when I started with the state of Texas, I went, oh my gosh, think of the opportunity. I mean, great, the work in Texas was amazing, but in many cases we were trying to continue programs as opposed to grow things into a new future. And of course, Harold, reading the vision statement that you read, we take that incredibly seriously in terms of this intersection between community and culture and all of the ways, we talk about hope, recovery, and well-being in a very broad sense. So you look at the funding that we have, and you mentioned, right now it's actually up to $2.7 billion is our annual budget. We have almost 6,000 employees with the department. It is a huge undertaking, and with that undertaking is both opportunity and huge challenges. And so, again, when I started this position under a new director, as you can imagine, coming into a department, we had a department that we needed to respect the traditions and the work of the past, but then grow things in very different ways. And that's what we're trying to do right now.
Could you tell us about what you've been doing with Why We Rise?
I was challenged a few months in to do something, with the funds that we have that focus on prevention and early intervention. And I should mention, of course, the statute that passed was very structured in terms of what funding went to what efforts. Because as we look at doing things about campaigns, of course, people also look at the need here for treatment. They look at the people who are across this county. We have 58,000 homeless individuals. We are absolutely doing some things that address that very specifically. In fact, again, if you're here in California, Proposition 2 passed. This passed, earlier last month, and basically resulted in some of the money for mental health services going directly to the homeless populations that had not been tagged that way before. But in any case, in May, I decided, and my inspiration for this came from what happened in Parkland. I was watching March for Our Lives. I was listening to Edna Chavez, a young woman from South Central Los Angeles, at the rally in DC, talking about how the trauma in her life, dodging bullets before she learned to read in her terms, losing her brother. And I looked at that and I said, there's nothing more important than for us to create a space for empowerment. Not empower these young people, they were empowering themselves, but create a space where those conversations could take place. And of that came an event called We Rise. We Rise was an immersive experience on mental health that went from May 19th to June 10th, 24/7, and it focused on culture and music and art and every part of the creative environment, and panels and conversations around mental health, focusing on 14 to 24-year-olds. And I will say, the first night, after we did this in a very different way, we had musicians, we had the Black Eyed Peas debut a video there, we had Common, we had influencers. I don't know if any of you know the rapper named YG. That was an interesting saga because YG was going to perform. Having YG perform was about a lot of metal detectors too, and changing an environment that was for well-being. That gave me some concerns. YG sat on the stage and talked to Scott Budnick, who directed the Hangover movies, about trauma in his life in a way that was transformative in terms of how people who were the followers, the 5 million people who follow YG, right, were reaching out. And what I'll say is at the end of that event, when I would go up to families who would be there and they'd say, yeah, I told my kid that we were going to a mental health event. They're like, why would we want to do that? And then they'd say, it's called We Rise. And they'd say, oh, we know about that. And Harold, it's interesting, you just mentioned the RAND Corporation, because we commissioned the RAND Corporation to evaluate this campaign.
Great.
It just came out 3 weeks ago, and it showed 22% of young people in this county knew about We Rise. So that's the way that we're doing things, through culture, through connections in a different way, and we're going to be growing that this coming year.
A couple days ago in the Sentinel about a project you guys are doing with community gardening in urban areas.
Saturday morning I was reading JAMA, because I have no life. Anyway, and it was talking about a study that had come out looking in Philadelphia at urban lots that had been abandoned and were not, of course, a positive environment for people in those locations. And it said after a 4-year study, and again, this is the Journal of the American Medical Association, that there was an increase of, or decrease in depression among people in those environments by up to 60%.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, oh gosh, we got lots here in LA, and I found an amazing group called Lot to Spot. I called them up and I said, can you help us? And they were already doing that work, turning lots into green areas. And so we created a garden, and I was just talking to one of my fellow panelists here, where now we have in the Watts community, people growing vegetables and also connected, because of course through connection, through community building is how a lot of the healing takes place. And we're going to be doing a lot more of those here in LA County. Yeah, so we're really excited about that as well.
In Los Angeles, in South Central, there are not a lot of trees, and the trees were cut down so that the helicopters would be able to see the neighborhoods, and it was just, when I couldn't believe it, but it's true. I'm born and raised in the city, and there are not many parks.
And yeah, I do think that this is just a huge, and a simple way in many ways to really look at some of these issues. And we did this garden from start to finish with everything. We got a lot of media attention. I'm glad you saw that article.
Yeah,
we came
sure.
out that day and talked about this initiative. So in fact, I just yesterday was talking to someone about how there's a group of people who've come from Cambodia that have settled in Long Beach. There were farmers there. They want to be doing farming in their environment here, so we're going to be supporting their efforts to do a community garden in Long Beach coming up in the next month. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you. Let me ask you, how do men experience trauma differently, I guess, than women? What are some of the hallmark signals of how men deal with
I
trauma?
think one of the first ways is, so what we know about trauma, literally the word trauma comes from the Greek traumatikos, which means wound. And if in the language of us in normal, trauma equals wound, in the language of men, trauma equals weak. And I think there is this great prohibition against men being able to talk about trauma or to even see experiences as trauma. We're actually told that those experiences make us men, or those experiences are for our own good, or those experiences are because we deserved it. You see wonderful depictions of the power and pain of trauma through Good Will Hunting and what that young man had to deal with, and just in like the struggle that he had to connect. And that's one of the ways that it plays out, is that these messages, these ways that men are raised, that I call them man rules, because they are enforced like rules in many, many ways. These man rules show up a lot around disconnection. And healing and trauma healing is about connection. But yet if our default from a stress-related perspective or from a limbic response, if you want to use the language of trauma, where it's a fight, flight, or freeze reaction, if part of that that's really been inculcated into us and who we are is about disconnection, there's this constant dance that I watch so many men have between connection and disconnection. And a lot of that is trauma. A lot of that is shame. The way that we fight can be a limbic reaction, and that's the externalization of trauma. And we see that more commonly socially accepted. It's a long conversation in that I spend time breaking this down for folks, because a lot of this stuff is invisible. How we raise boys to be men, we don't write it out. But if I sat here and I queried this audience and I said, what are the man rules? They'd give them to me, and we'd have the exact same answers that I get everywhere else I go.
Oh yeah, my favorite saying, my dad, hold your mud, you know. Being, you know, when I got sober, I got sober, the first movie my wife and I saw was, the River Phoenix movie. Anyway, it was very sad. And I couldn't, it was like running on empty. And when this kid, his parents were leaving, they're on a run, they said leave the kid there. And I remember I wanted to bawl my eyes out. I couldn't, it was uncontrollable. And of course I felt embarrassed. Of course I felt shameful. It was, but I want to talk just a little bit. You have just devised a strategy based on the 12 steps of AA to deal with men's trauma, and I'd like to hear about that.
It's partially connected to the 12 steps. So I've written a couple of books. One's called A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, where I really felt that the way that men are raised to be men matters in how we help men in recovery. It matters in how we help men in any kind of therapeutic intervention, in fact. So it started through my own recovery, but has really expanded beyond that, from the 12 steps even now to just kind of men in relationships. That so much of what we expect from men in relationships is counter to how we raise men. We want men to be intimate, to be vulnerable, to be partners, to compromise, to share power, and yet for so many of us, for so long, that's been the opposite message of our lives. So these strategies that I've devised and that I've worked with others to create are all about how do we redesign these services to be more effective for men? How do we allow for the engagement process, clinical engagement, to be more designed effectively for men, and perhaps more importantly, to notice how when men are disengaging from services, that could be a trauma response. Not just somebody who is acting defiantly or oppositionally or rejecting services, but that in fact, that could be a trauma response that takes that man again from a limbic response back into a very reactive state that shows up in an extreme form of these mannerisms. So rather than viewing, this is maybe a good way of describing it, rather than viewing those men that we consider to be, malaccepting of treatment or disobedient, or what are the clinical terms that we use for disengaged men, we view that as engagement. We view that as the essence of where men are experiencing this crucible, this dichotomy of how they've been raised versus what we're now asking them and even telling them they must do.
To kind of keep this facade up.
That's part of reframing from a strength-based perspective how we see men's behavior and how we see men showing up. And so from that perspective, what are the adaptive strategies? A lot of it is unconscious. Anger is an adaptive strategy, and it's very effective for getting us what we want. We learn very early not to be vulnerable and not to show feelings other than anger. And then we wonder why men are so angry. Well, the truth is, that's an adaptive strategy. I don't want you to hurt me, so what can I do? Well, I can be angry, and I can be defiant, or I can at least keep you at a distance. So a lot of these adaptive strategies are about disconnection, but it's really ultimately, and this is something I would impress upon people as much as anything that you walk away with from anything I may say, is that at the essence of this is safety. When you talk about trauma, you talk about safety. And when you talk about men, how men show up in a space of disconnection is a safety response. It's not them being, a-holes, pardon me, but it's true, that so much of how we view men as violent, as contemptuous, as disengaged, as workaholic, as sex addicted, so much of that are adaptive strategies to safety that don't work, and yet they're in the minuscule universe of options that we've given men for connection.
Particularly Annie Nelson and Tess Monaco, and Annie is from American Soldiers Network. They, I believe, well, you work with a lot of vets, and can you just, what are some of the, what is your program? What do you exactly?
Right now our focus is suicide prevention, and we, between 2015 2016, I buried 30 veterans in 1 year, 9 were active duty, and at that point, we circled the troops basically within our organization, and I said, we're done. It's not about a number. Everybody in the community has seen people hashtag a certain number, And in the veteran community, it's done a disservice by focusing on a number, not the human being in the brain. I'm a PTS survivor, I'm a 2-time brain tumor survivor, and I'm a TBI survivor as a civilian. And so it seemed that my path, for me, the guy up in the sky had been programming me or guiding my journey to what I've gone through to put me right in the path that I need to be in at this time. And after marrying 30 that 1 year, I was just like, this is too much. I'm in the veteran community. I've been embedded with our veterans and our military since 2004, and I founded the organization in 1996, so we're not a new pop-up. And in the veteran community and in the military community, I don't think people realize that the new numbers are back. And General Mattis has found out that we're at an uptake. We're over 25 a day right now. And that just came back within like last month. And General Mattis is extremely impassioned by it, and you'll be seeing some new things that are happening. And I'm not sure when they're going to officially be announced, but you'll see a major funding effort as well as a major, I guess a word could be like a task force or something that's going to be focused just on suicide prevention for the veteran and military community. But I think one thing that is a disservice to the veteran and military community is people don't realize that if you look at the history of it, World War II, Korea, we didn't really have this situation. It's been impacting the veterans, Vietnam veterans. It's the #1 killer of Vietnam veterans in our country. We didn't have it happen in Desert Storm, and now it's impacting Iraq and post 9/11. So if you think of those things, you need to take it apart and not look at it as just, let's be reactionary, but we need to be preventative, and we need to start telling a different story, and we need to change stigma. I think the term mental health for this community is very disconnecting, as you would say, and it creates a bigger stigma, and we're not better along than we have been with the Vietnam era. Social media is just as bullying and just as spitting in the face as we were back then when they came home. The World Health Organization put out a study that by the year 2030, the #1 global disease is going to be depression. Now that's not just for us, even though 40,000 Americans are taking their lives every year of suicide. Of those 40,000 Americans, 20% belong to the veteran and military community. So there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot more that we can sit here and talk until the concert starts just on this topic. We just launched a site called ruckup.org, and Ruckup is a preventative resource site for all veterans and military. It's the only site on the internet that has an ID-verified, safe, secured space for veterans and military only, that we partnered with ID.me, so that they can actually get in there, and they have a chat room that is vet-verified, and it's veterans monitoring veterans, and the software was built with some psychiatrists that if there's someone in the chat room that is having a moment, I guess you would say, or several, and they're using a certain language that the software picks up, it'll send a red flag alert to the monitoring team that is veterans, and they can reach out to that gentleman or woman outside of the chat and try to intercede, because the veteran and military community, they watch out for each other because they've had to. In Vietnam, they didn't have anybody. It took them 30 years, and you had the creation of Vietnam Veterans of America, and that was because they had to watch out for their own. And it's happening again, and they feel that they have to do that, and they have to step out of the VA because there's been a lot of mistrust. So within Ruckup, there's the aid station, and the aid station is based on zip codes. So you can go into your zip code, you can find facilities around the country, not surfing trips and day trips, and those are phenomenal, but they're not telling you to go after you get done surfing and get help. So you can escape for a day and enjoy amazing things, but you're not treating anything. So the aid station has facilities that treat mental health, TBI, CTE, addiction, and depression that are outside the VA system, because quite frankly, there's a lot of people that aren't going to go. And of the numbers that we know are 25, those are only numbers that are attached to the VA. And we've got an awful lot of men and women that won't go to the VA and that are in the system. So the numbers are actually higher. So when you think about everything that's happening in that community, the media is really doing them a disservice as well. We need to put pressure on the media to start representing our veterans better and stop talking about PTS and talking about PTG. I bet nobody here knows what PTG is, post-traumatic growth.
Like, and I was watching the news this morning, and I heard a rumor that there was a rear admiral that
He
died.
committed suicide 2 days ago. He's in charge of the entire naval fleet.
Naval fleet in the Middle East, and a rear admiral, they didn't discuss on the news what he died of. It wasn't foul play, but he died of suicide. He was a combat veteran. In the music community over the last few years, I mean all through, you know, we've had deaths, but particularly in the last 3 years, 5 years, there's been a number of deaths. And I just heard a great term about suicide. It's almost a biological term about a contagion. And the contagion is one person starts something, when suicide, particularly with adolescents and kids, I mean, it just spreads out from there. I'm wondering if this has something to do with why those vets today are why there's such a high rate. I know I have to, I might have to get back to you, but I also want to acknowledge Tess. Tess, let me get back to you a little bit later because I want to make sure I get to the panelists in one time. But if you want to, please introduce yourself.
I'm the Executive Director of the UCLA VA Veteran Family Wellness Center. I served in the Marine Corps until a traumatic injury ended my time in the Marine Corps, and shortly after that time, my active duty husband died by suicide on active duty, so I'm very familiar with the issues that you described. And also, while on active duty, I was subject to military sexual trauma, which is something that you hear a lot about. So,
Could you repeat that?
Military sexual trauma. So, yeah, assaults on active duty, some of them are reported, some of them aren't. I was one of the cases that didn't report what happened to me out of fear. The Marine Corps is a wonderful organization, but also very hyper-masculine, so those are some of the things that you speak about. And as a woman, it was a little bit challenging to feel like I had the voice to be able to say what had happened to me. But anyhow, military career over, I had to chart a new path. And these are some of the same elements that I find in my work in the veterans community, veterans and families actually, is mission, identity, meaning, and purpose. So you really have to kind of figure out who you are, where you're going, where you want to go next. And so in my work at the UCLA VA Veteran Family Wellness Center, which is a partnership, and I hope that there are many more of these public VA partnerships that happen, we are the first center of our kind in the VA system that serves the families alongside of the veterans. And the reason for that is there's a lot of research that shows that trauma is intergenerational.
Yeah.
It can be passed down to your children.
That's amazing.
And if there's no response, and especially a community response, I've worked with Mimi and Dr. Wong when I was over at USC, but the community response is so important because there was a 2017 Blue Star Family Survey that said 70% of transitioning veterans do not feel connected to the community around them. So we recognize that in the work that we do. We give actual actionable tools. Ours is wellness-based resilience, which is more preventative, as you mentioned. Don't wait for the PTSD to come erupting out. I was actually diagnosed with it in 2015, which is a very interesting experience for someone who has a clinical knowledge and background. And it was something that I had read, but I didn't know what was happening to me. And I think that a lot of veterans experience this and they white knuckle it. So I just want to say thank you to all you panelists and experts for having me here.
Well, I got to tell you, thank you. That's what we need to hear at this panel and for you. And so thank you so much. And hopefully next year we will arrange a panel to have you guys on. Absolutely. You have so much to say. And thank you for exposing to our folks. But I wanted to talk to Dr. Wong, and thank you for being here. We were so nervous that you would show up for the panel. So thank you. Because without you, I mean, we wouldn't have that. I think that what you have to offer us is pretty amazing. And I know you do a lot of work with children, adolescents, and trauma and mental health. Let me ask you just a basic question. How do children, adolescents experience trauma? And if you will, what are those different kinds of traumas that they experience?
Well, children experience trauma in a parallel way from the way in which was described before about fight, flight, freeze. But our research, and I really want to talk about the 20-year research partnership I've had with Rand Health and with the UCLA Partner Research Center, and to tell you a little bit about what's happening right here in Los Angeles, because I think it has an impact across other cities as well. In the urban cores. And previous to being at USC, I was the director of mental health and the crisis teams and suicide prevention programs for LA Unified School District, which was at that time the second largest school district in the US. There were 750,000 kids, K-12, and about 120,000 employees, the largest public employer in the city of Los Angeles. And what was a crisis in 1974 in the life of a child? It was like a child whose family was going through divorce.
Yeah.
But after 1984, it completely changed, and the culture of education changed. So if you think about, and I won't make eye contact with anyone in here, but if you were born before 1985, you did not know what a school shooting was. There was a fight down the street, like at the end of the gate, across the railroad track, and people gathered around, etc. But if you were born after 1985 and you went to kindergarten in 1990, you knew exactly what a school shooting was because it was on the news every single day. And it was the first spate of school shootings in which, people became extremely concerned, and it really prompted then, ultimately in 1997, actually the effort began, but it was published in 2000, it was called the Safe School Initiative. And it was the initial partnership between the Secret Service, think about this in the Department of Education, about how do you stop school shootings. The first one in the country that I know about was here in 1984 at the 49th Street School, elementary school, where a mentally ill man lived across the street in a second floor apartment. And he opened fire on children at the 49th Street Elementary School in South Central LA. And he held the school under sniper fire for an hour and a half. And at the end of that time, 2 children were killed. Several other of the adults, including school staff, the vice principal, etc., were shot and wounded. And there was no safe school plan. So think about, at your school, did you have a safe school plan? And some of you will say yes, and some of you will say absolutely not. What was that? And at that time in 1984, there was no safe school plan. There was no safe school legislation, either at a local or state level, or even at the federal level. So you can see that within a span of time, the culture of education truly began to change. And I was the mental health director for many years. And in the midst of all of this that was going on in the country, LA was experiencing gang shootings. So Los Angeles, between the years of 1988 and 1998, that was known as the decade of death, because 1,000 people were killed every year in Los Angeles, and mainly in South LA and East LA. And in the midst of all of that were kids in schools. There were bullets going through playgrounds and school buildings, and I have a graphic that I usually show when I do a presentation, and it shows a period of time in the West Valley, like, let me see, Parthenia, Woodland Hills or something. And then you should do a separate graphic from South LA. And what it showed was all of the unsolved homicides over a period of about 10 years. So in the West Valley, there'd be a couple of dots, it's a black dot, and they showed little monopoly-sized houses where the elementary schools were. And they would say, here's where the child would walk past this dot. And that would have been the place where a homicide happened and no one was ever caught. And you'd see, a few dots. And yet you look at the graphic in Los Angeles, and it was covered. It was almost totally black from the number of unsolved homicides. Not all the homicides, but the unsolved homicides. So it's in the midst of that we began our work at Rand and UCLA and at LA Unified School District, looking at cohorts of about 1,000 children across different zip codes. And in the zip codes in which there were the highest rates of crime and poverty and gang activity and substance use and abuse in the community, based on LAPD statistics, what we saw was that 88 to 92% of the children who were 11 years old, as we focused on middle school, 11-year-olds said they had been hit, kicked, punched, or threatened with a gun or knife in the community. And several of them had multiple incidences. So we know that the first risk factor of PTSD is exposure to violence and violent activity. And we went back in and we looked at these kids. 27% of the 11-year-olds had straight on PTSD, clinical levels of PTSD above the clinical level. An additional 16% had depression above the clinical level. And the really tragic part of it, what you were saying about being invisible, is that not one child was referred to a school psychologist, a counselor, a school social worker, or any person in the community, because it was invisible. And there were people who cared, there were parents who didn't know what it was, but they treated it like a discipline problem. You know, why won't my kid go to school? Why is he keep getting into trouble? Why are my boys fighting? Why are the girls staying home? Why are they waking up in the middle of the night with disrupted sleep? You know, what is going on? And so they would punish them. And when we would interview these parents, they would say, you know, I didn't know there was such a thing as PTSD in children. I was getting physical with my children. So we know there's a lot of education that needs to go on. And actually our research contributed to Cal Mesa back then to the PEI.
Excuse me, say that again, please.
I'm sorry, okay, that's a secret language of the county.
Yeah, I figured that. I thought it was that.
Prevention, early intervention,
Okay.
PEI. And MHSA means the Mental Health Services Act, which refers to the millionaire's tax and the dollars that are collected that go to prevention activities.
So, Dr. Wong, I understand you have developed some assessment tools for trauma for children. Could you talk a little bit about that assessment? What constitutes what levels of trauma, so forth?
I'm happy to. Well, one of them is actually one of the identified interventions that's evidence-based by the County of Los Angeles. It's called the Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools. Because what we were seeing is so many kids in the schools were suffering from traumatic stress that we needed to have something where they could be provided with an intervention in schools, with, of course, parental consent. We published the effectiveness study in 2003 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it was recognized by JAMA as an original contribution to medicine. Since then, some schools, it's been disseminated across the country. The uptick was probably first in New Orleans and the regions affected by Katrina hurricanes. But ever since then, it's been disseminated around the country. So it started after Columbine, but also in Newtown, Connecticut, they asked for training. The Connecticut State Department, the Commission of Education, has now required it as a training for all school personnel.
And you mentioned Katrina, you mentioned some of the natural disasters we have. I completely, it just goes over my head when I think that people may have experienced true PTSD as a result of natural disasters. So,
Like the fires.
like the fires, exactly.
Exactly, there was a call out. So CBITS has been used after we're training in Las Vegas School District now after the massacre there. We're in Parkland, they asked for help there. It's the only evidence-based, school-based intervention that I know about in the country. And we follow that up because other areas in the country don't have the same level of resources that LA have or big cities have. And teachers were saying, well, we know our children are traumatized. Can you modify this so that a teacher who's trauma-informed can provide some kind of intervention? So we modified it and we developed the SSET, which is support to students exposed to trauma. Now, the good news about this is that both of these have been gone through randomized clinical trials, but the manuals are free. So you go onto the RAND.org website and you put in either CBITS, CBITS, which is Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools, and it'll take you to the SAG website, and you can just, put in a bunch of paper, go to dinner, come back, and you'll have the whole manual for free for both of those interventions. We want it to be in the public domain.
This a thought occurred to me with with so much childhood trauma in our life. Because when I was in school, you're absolutely right. We it wasn't in our language or vocabulary. Do you think there's a correlation between this early PTSD, bullying, there any studies that they've looked at?
With respect to trauma, but we suspect that there's a high correlation, a high association between some aspects of bullying and post-traumatic stress disorder. I also have, you brought up the word contagion, and I also, when you look at the school shooters, 75% of them were suicidal.
Right.
There's a real connection there in my mind about being suicidal and homicidal.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And they're two sides of the same coin. And when you read about these school shooters, there's a period of what they call fluidity that happens just before the actual perpetration of that horrible crime, and that is they seriously consider suicide.
So listen, I want to turn over to Bob to talk about what Patrick's got going and his organization. And Bob, thank you so much.
Awesome job. What I've learned so far is that we're on the right track, that by doing these events on an annualized basis, that the topic is broad enough, brain and mental wellness. And that phrase is really important to me, not mental health, brain and mental wellness. And it's broad, and it's everything from the veterans community to Alzheimer's and autism, as I said. And so with that thought in mind, it's really my pleasure to open a discussion with Patrick, who came all the way from New York as the CEO of the Center for Discovery. He's been at this for 38 years, and from my perspective, he's probably the model for the rest of the country, and I hope we're successful in the next year or two to really show what we've done at the center. So I wonder, Patrick, if you could just tell us a little bit about what the center's been doing, and how you tie together today's discussion with the objectives of the center.
But the center, like a lot of disability services, started in the 40s and 50s, and I got into it in the 70s, where the big institutions were closing. A lot of the folks we took out of the institutions were dangerous and traumatized by living with thousands of people unsupervised. So I got a real big start in dealing with that issue of trauma associated with food and a lot of other things, and I'll talk how we sort of evolved the center. But we, early on, in the early 80s, we wanted to move away from disability-centric thinking, which is, I just couldn't stand having my name cerebral palsy, and so we moved to Center for Discovery for a while. But I found in my work over these last many decades that you lose the whole person when you go after the label, retarded, CP, autistic. So we're really not, I'm sort of anti-advocacy, disability-centric wackies, and I go after the whole person. And so with that, a lot of how the center evolved, we deal with very complex people, the most complex kids and adults in New York State, and some other states send kids to us as well. And we're realizing, particularly in brain regulation, I used to say in the early days, when I would be opening a house in a community where people were afraid to have disabilities, people with disabilities living next to them. I remember saying, about 38 years ago, I go, listen, if you live long enough, you join this club. Now that was 38 years ago, before the onset of all dementia disorders, living so much longer. And also the prevalence of disabilities in those days was 1 in 10,000, 1 in 30,000. Down syndrome was one of the more prevalent, and I think that was 1 in maybe 8,000 if you're over 35 years of age. So it was there, but for the grace of God, you didn't see folks. But now, with the prevalence of autism and all of the Alzheimer's and dementia related for typical aging, you see it everywhere. So I actually have people 38 years later calling me and said, my grandson is autistic, or my wife has Alzheimer's, and I remember you yelling at us that they basically call me and say, by the way, I've lived long enough, I've joined the club. So with that kind of thinking, the center tries to look at the whole person, which really translates to all of us. And we now have an image of the autistic brain and the Alzheimer's brain, and they're almost identical, and they all have the same underlying complexities. So my argument with caregiving is, we have to almost be like that poker game where we say we're all in, that we're all on this, and if we put all our money together to figure this thing out and not stick it in different spots for the whole person, I think we're going to go a much longer way. Am I rushing past that?
No, not at all. I wondered, I visited the center and I want to continue to do so, but I'm just fascinated at your holistic approach from growing your own food to owning parts of the town where everybody has a job, and the work you've done with brain and gut connectivity and all that, I think, again, can be a national model.
Years ago, even disciplines like PT, OT, and speech, they weren't what they are today. They were very pedestrian. OTs worked with firemen who broke a leg and had to get back to work. PTs did burn patients. Speech were speech teachers. Nursing was one of the most holistic training groups. So initially, our population were very medically fragile. So I was the first in New York to bring nurses in. I had a saying years ago, I never met a nurse I didn't like. And unfortunately, I never met a social worker I did. 38 years later, I have a couple hundred nurses and about 4 social workers, but I'm teasing, I have some great but I realized that the paradigm shift that had happened back then for caregivers were, you had to move from caring for sick people to making people healthy. And the first thing when you think of that is food. And I was having kids rejecting antibiotics, so we started our farming operation in the early 80s. And now we grow food for about 1,900 meals a day, biodynamically, so we're like pretty hip in the food stuff. When I first did it, initially the institutional people said, oh, you're going to build farms just like they did 100 years ago. And I know this is going to be a hip farm. And now we're pretty hip with that kind of thing. We've trademarked food as medicine, so food is a big deal. Particularly, that was developed for kids who were medically fragile, who really had to be pounded a lot of antibiotics, so we didn't want to bring anything in through food, particularly through meat. And I was telling the folks from Texas that we brought in one of the first big herds of Quinina cattle, which is this big Tuscan cow, because it's very lean meat. They just brought me back to Lyndon Johnson and all those cow people. But we now grow food for a lot of people. And we have a big research institute with food. We're looking at obesity and stuff, and particularly in the autism population now. We see one of their big underlying issues is a real bad gut disorders and a lot of autoimmune dysfunction inside the gut. And they're working on trauma all the time because they're sort of caught up in fight, flight all the time. And a lot of similarities in dealing with trauma, sleep deprivation, and all the other kinds of things that we're working on. And that's what brought us to the 82nd Airborne. We do work with World Team Sports initially for physically disabled vets. But now in the last year or so, we have a relationship with the 82nd where we actually take active troops in and we work them through exercise and healthy food and conversation. And in that process, I'm realizing a lot of the soldiers would come to me that I have a child with autism, and when I'm deployed, my wife is in so much stress over it. So we're trying to help the Army get more attention to that kind of issue that's right in everybody's face, and they're just not getting after it. So exercise, we have a big research institute, and we're looking at brain health, and we see with brain health, physical activity is so important too. So John Brady from Harvard and Bessel and some of these other cats, we're doing all kinds of physical activities for treatment that we're really finding to be very successful with kids.
I'm also aware of the New Children's Hospital and Research Institute.
Yes, the idea is to really create a treatment model that's in real time, urgent, and with the family and the school district, so that right now in New York, and I think it's here too, that once a kid gets thrown out of the system, they get placed lifelong, and we're going to try to really put an urgent care model in place. And with that, we have a major research institute that's going after a bunch of things with complex disorders. Particularly, we've just launched a medicinal marijuana study for intractable seizures. We're growing with the U.S. Ag Department, with our big farming operation, we're growing hemp to really try to see if growing it biodynamically, can we get a better CBD oil that's pure. You know, it's interesting about medicinal marijuana and even hemp, there's no regulations for pesticides and all kinds of crazy stuff. And when you're forced to grow inside, all kinds of nasty things happen. So we have the federal, I get flyovers by the federal ATF all the time to make sure I don't have anybody migrating into my hemp fields. But the medicinal marijuana study is going to be really important. And I know out here you guys are using a lot of marijuana for behaviors and things like that. My big worry with that, because I intuit that this is some good stuff, but there's really no one's ever done any dosing studies. So this is going to be the first to really give physicians and moms and dads a better understanding of dosing, or else this remarkable possibility is just going to go to hell if a couple of kids die. So that's sort of a quick take on the show here. And I guess...
No, and I would argue if you are going to be a national model, you really need to be open source. So
yeah,
a lot of that data that you're collecting, the ability to share that nationally can be very important.
Yeah, in my engineering department, we designed something with Google, since I have a relationship here with the Google people out here. And we worked on a platform that was developed by actually a physical education teacher and clinicians, talking about open sourcing. That in our relationship with Google, we have to open source this, but it's like a hoverboard platform that weighs about 35 pounds, that a manual wheelchair, and a lot of vets are checking this out right now, can roll up on, click in, and power. It's a pretty sexy thing too, called Indigo. And so you'll be seeing that, and Airbus may take it as a people mover. But it was developed with some of our vets and some of the kids who, a power wheelchair on average costs about $18,000, and we can develop this for under $2,000. And so it's going to be a developing world kind of event, but we think the vets are going to love it because it's quick. And it has really, it's got to be sexy. Boom, they're in it. And so that's something that the center is attempting to take. I have the smartest staff on earth. I mean, I have 1,700 staff, and they are literally the best people on the planet. So I'm looking to market the hell out of them around the planet. And this is starting what we're attempting to do, and that's why I guess I'm here in California.
And the only other thing I would mention is, I know the tech companies are under assault right now, being in Washington, but they do a lot of good as well. And I know Michael Rosen, for example, and I both worked for Autism Speaks, and there was a partnership with Google and Autism Speaks where they were able to map 10,000 human genomes to really get a better understanding of the spectrum of autism. And frankly, it's because NIH couldn't do it. They just didn't have the computing capacity. So that money was raised privately, nevertheless, but it was open source and shared, and there's some tremendous innovations that are occurring because of that initial research.
The last thing on moms and dads who haven't slept in 7 years, and this is the other thing that I was hoping would come out of this, is usually trauma people and I are, although Besson is a good friend of mine, we're not at the same dais, and we have to start getting together on this stuff to really get this all in thing, and particularly with stigma. See, my work, came out of dealing with people who were not considered human. They were called vegetables. They were taken from their family at birth, and the family accepted the state to say, this is too complicated. Neurologists would often say, he won't know who you are, put him away. And I walked into these institutions, and I'm still I go to work every day to fight. And because it's so close to coming back, if it's not already here, when we run into a problem that we don't understand, it's so easy to name it and then lock it up. And we have to be very careful. This is a very important time for all of us to get after it. You know, the new R word is demented. All of a sudden you're demented, you're dead. That's not the case. We can work and help people with brain dysregulation. So we really have to get ready for this hard, because we're running into, if we look at the room, we got a lot of people with complex issues. And we've got to see the person, not the name. And I think we do that, we're going to go a long way.
I would argue it's not just that.
Marie, your world. I'm a mental health and economic development educator through entertainment and technology. I work with Bob on concerts and things like that. Each one of you, including yourselves, I have thoughts I'm not going to dominate, but I'm going to throw one quick point to each. And I'm not sure if I should do it at once or sequentially, that I think might add to the conversation. So I will begin with you, Dana, if I may. And I have a master's in education with a focus on mental health, specifically family systems theory, as it applies to culture and meaning. So my question for you is, your expertise is in the area of male identity, male being relevant to trauma. I couldn't help but wonder, because that culture, the culture that you're from, enculturates women warriors to be similar. Just wondered to what extent your work was extensible to women as well, women warriors and women youth and women in life. And I'm of a belief that probably maybe as many as 30% of all women, at least in our culture, probably others, suffer from PTSD. By the way, I walk away today with PTG now. As I've never heard that before. I love that. But I'd just be curious to hear from you about how this may apply to women as well.
We're all in the soup of gender. And so there's the woman rules, there's the man rules, and in my audience, it's mostly women when I do public speaking, but especially when I train clinicians, because 70% of the people that are going through services are men, but 70% of the people providing those services tend to be women. And so I've been challenged, actually, in the years that I've done this work, to focus on women, because I was very focused on men. And I think when you begin to, certainly when I began to expand the scope to gender, I use a concept I think that would be helpful here. I use a concept called the water. And the water is essentially, when two fish are at the bottom of the ocean, another fish swims up and says, "Hey guys, how's the water?" and swims off, and those two fish say, "What the hell is water?" Right? Like, that's us. We are fish in the water, and gender is deep, deep in the water. And so we don't necessarily notice it on a daily or hourly basis how much it's showing up in our lives. So when we begin to really pay attention to that and unpack it, it has profound implications for us. So you take a hyper-masculine environment, like the military, where, however, you can look at masculinity in our culture and say it's very confused right now. But the essence of hyper-masculinity in a military culture is about survival. It's about knowing exactly what you need to do when your life is on the line. So that takes precedence in many ways over this more relaxed or conscious masculinity that I talk about. So in reference to women, they're going to be acculturated into a hyper-masculine environment. But they've still got the woman rules, and they still are with men who've got the man rules, which is to objectify women, which is to treat sex as a primary method of communication. And when you have a lot of people, I think there's some research that shows the percentage of people who have backgrounds of trauma that come into the military, and that is one of the factors for developing PTSD later on. So you have that, and then you have the use of substances, all of that happening in this culture where you then have the sexual assault, and you have this more shadow side of stuff that's happening. So women have to navigate a hyper-masculine culture while at the same time still being viewed as women. And so it's that same double standard that women get in this society, I believe probably gets magnified in the military culture. And so I think it becomes complicated. I'm just now starting to really expand the scope of my work to women and to families, and it's been powerful for me to notice that. I think I'm an advocate of consciousness, and I think the more conscious we are of how gender influences and affects our lives, then the more clear we can be about who we are and how we interact in our relationships, and that in many ways is part of it. It's kind of a deep hip sort of thing in some ways, right? I mean, it's amorphous and it's not that tangible, but consciousness, without it, there's no us, so.
One thing that I wanted to mention just in terms of the way approaches have changed about how the media covers things, that Dr. Wong, you were talking about the school shootings and how that was something that until the early 80s, that wasn't really part of the dialogue. So I mentioned I was in Austin, Texas for many years. 1966 was the shooting at UT in front of the tower. That was a school shooting. That was the first of these incidences. That anniversary was 50 years just took place. The trauma and the way in which that event was totally covered up by the media, by the university, by everyone involved with that. It wasn't until that 50-year anniversary there was a plaque on that campus, which when you think about how things have changed, when you look at what happened in Parkland, and of course that gentleman, that was a military background, the gentleman who perpetrated that event. So you just think about the change there, the way the media, I mean seriously, I did a study of that when I was getting a master's in communications at UT. It wasn't talked about. A week later it was like it had not happened. So think about that, think about the trauma with those people and their families. And so then 50 years on, they were interviewing the students that were on this campus. And to me, it's just transformative when you think about how, now again, I mentioned Parkland. You think about those kids and the way they harness the energy of the media with their message in a way that we had never seen before. So
I believe that the lack of meaning is what drives these events so that people can have a sense of identity. But it brings me to the last one. My career commenced 34 years ago when I woke up and realized at that time there were 479 students per counselor. And now in California alone it's 1,000 students per counselor from what I understand. And I heard that there is no mental health education for kids per se, except if they're highly truant. So it seems that most everything that unfolds is reactive. To what extent could you envision a growing cavalcade of campaigns that would actually be educating kids that they're intelligent, why they're in school, why their parents get divorced, etc., etc. That would be my last question.
Well, I think education needs to take place with people who take care of children. In local parentis are the Latin words that drive the relationship, that define the relationship between educators and children. In the place of the parents during a school day, the parental role is carried by educators and everyone in the school. I think that I'm concerned that teachers don't have to take one class in mental health in their training years, so that they're these wonderful, highly committed, dedicated people of all ages. They think, I really want to make a difference. They go to school, they become subject matter experts in social science and math and all that, and they get into a classroom, and here's trauma. Here are kids acting out. So I think that's where it has to start. And I don't know exactly how this fits in, but I just want to say that there are various levels at which we need to intervene. There's certainly the individual level, but there's also the systemic level. And during the previous administration, the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education, you may know this already, filed a series of complaints against school districts across the country that were brought by parents. And they were brought by parents of color on behalf of their children. That children of color were being expelled at 4 or 5 times the rates of children who were Caucasian, Asian, whatever. And that the expulsion rate started in preschool, 4 times the rate. And right here in Los Angeles, a civil rights complaint was brought against LA Unified School District. So I'm not talking out of turn, it was a public, it's public information. And in 1 year, 47,000 children were expelled from LA Unified Schools, and they were all children, they were African American and Latino children. So education, I think you gotta start with the people who take care of children, because sometimes I think we're just overburdening children. Like, you need to be strong and you need to do this. How about the people who take care of children, protecting them, connecting with them, listening to them, acting on their behalf? And that includes parents. Parents who allow their children to get to guns that are they're not protected. They're not safety protected. So I do agree, it's education, but I think it's at that level first, because I'm looking at the system. I'm concerned about the children, but I'm also concerned about the system.
The title of this is America Salutes You, so I want to turn around to America Salutes Bob Oken. And the question is, will you salute Bob Oken? The answer is yes. I just want to say his passion about veterans and pulling together this whole thing with the global television special is really just more than superb. It comes right from his heart. His organizational ability is just staggering, and it's jaw-dropping. Now, the way to think of me is I've 50 years in public service. I've had the privilege of creating and then running a program for each of the last 8 presidents of the United States. And with Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, we created more than 10 million jobs in inner cities. So I'm sort of the big thinker and the action guy. I'm not very good at scheduling because I thought this was from 2 to 4. And I just want to make some statement of what we're doing, and then after this, if anybody wants to talk to me, that would be great. Because I do not have a direct question for the panel. But in 2014, I got into the whole crisis about stress, and stress got me into meditation. And that changed my life. So in Delaware, we're getting good news. We've trained now over 2,700 people in mindfulness on our way to training 16,000. And I've got all of the elected officials behind it. The governor, the lieutenant governor, the senators, everybody. And that's a big breakthrough. And what we're doing in Delaware is, if you take trauma, it's a question of making everybody collaborative, because people love to fight. So we have the trauma-informed, trauma recovery experts, working with the SEL experts, and our team is sort of an expert about mindfulness and meditation and stress reduction. And with the governor, my whole thing is I want to make the governor an historic governor. Nothing to do with me, I have nothing to gain out of it, other than the joy of doing something big. So the idea is in Delaware, we want to create self-sustaining systems which address trauma and the untapped powers of our mind and bring it straight statewide. And then we'll take it and go around the country. And I'm here with Bob, which is my honor, because in Delaware, John Kabat-Zinn trainers worked with 1,500 Vietnam veterans and transformed the lives of 300 to 400 of them. So being a rambunctious big thinker guy, I go all across the country with our nonprofit gift and with all sorts of collaborative partners, and we will transform the lives of 100,000 veterans and active duty military using the high forms of mindfulness. And I now work with politicians to jump with the presidents, and we make mindfulness and trauma. Our goal will be to make mindfulness and trauma important for all the United States senators if they see that transform the lives of the veterans in their state, plus the leadership of the United States Congress. So that's not a question, but America salutes policy.
So before I became an investor in early stage technology companies, I was a producer. In the television business, I was actually involved as one of the executive producers of The Deadly Tower, which was the movie about the Austin shooting in 1966. We made that in 1975. It was Kurt Russell's first adult role, and it was the first time a Latino star was in a starring lead role in a television movie. And that certainly created a lot of social awareness too. It was based on a horrible, tragic event that the whole country heard about, but it became an entertainment vehicle, but also to create social, well-being and awareness. I also produced a movie in 1983, which was called Cocaine, One Man's Addiction, with Dennis Weaver. That was the first movie that starred an adult having a cocaine abuse problem. And that all led to my being able to connect with Marie and EIC. So I've been a proud EIC board member for, 20 years? I can't count past 20 anymore. Anyway, the EIC has been an incredible organization. It's provided a lot of resources to people that are in both the health and healing area as well as in the entertainment area. So I guess my question is for the panel, and maybe just a general question is, are there enough organizations out there like EIC? Is EIC well regarded and well utilized for the kind of resources that it provides in terms of science-based information for depiction of movies and television?
And I say, no, we need more. And again, it's the field that I come from as well. I mean, I think there's been more understanding, and when you look at, I think the award shows and this attention has now been something that I've seen more of the popular press pick up. But no, I mean, it definitely needs to be more of it. And yes, thank you very much, Marie, for these efforts. Really
One of our recipient charities is the
We tell story writers is to look at people and ask not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And hopefully that's where, if the stories come from that perspective, that we have a public, it's sort of like the Petri dish. We're going to be that public that will be very supportive of the right kind of services. Because there is so much pain. There's just so much pain everywhere. It's overwhelming.
Side segue is we have a very special guest, one of the world's greatest guitarists. He's played in the American Saloon concerts twice now, so you're an alum. I'm an alum. So Dave Navarro, and I'm sure everyone.
One word about David is that, David, you have supported suicide prevention awareness and mental health issues. You've done benefits for not only your organization, but for Music Cares. And you're a great friend and a great spokesman on behalf of the music community to the youth of America. I want to really congratulate you.
Yeah, where am I jumping in here? First of all, sorry I'm late. I was waiting at the spa for about half an hour.
This is the wrap up, so you're
This is the wrap up. What are we talking about? Trauma? We're talking about addiction? We're talking about mental health?
brain and mental wellness.
All right, well, I am a first-person trauma survivor. When I was 15 years old, my mother and my aunt were murdered by her boyfriend. That is not, it's in addition to the pre-verbal trauma that I experienced, which we all have. Pre-verbal trauma is something that, like when a baby's crying and doesn't know why it's feeling bad and it's unattended to, that's a traumatic situation for a baby. It actually happens in the womb. And so all these traumatic events embed themselves in our physiology and in our parasympathetic nervous system, and we carry trauma with us. And that's why the event next door is so important to me, because these guys are out there putting their lives on the line for us, and a lot of them come back with PTSD, much like I suffer from. Yeah. And so I certainly want to be there for them and do whatever I can to support them. But in terms of treatment and working through trauma, I have found that it's pretty important to get with someone you trust, or a friend, or a loved one, or a therapist, or a psychiatrist, whatever that is, and get into a position where you can tell your traumatic story in a linear timeline. So it's right shaped. It's not little pieces of it bouncing around your brain. You know when it started, you know what happened, you know when it ended. And having that process can be a really great tool for healing. And one of the things about the PTSD and the trauma that I survived, and seeing these guys come home with PTSD, and I heard some political views and things being talked about, and we're all living in a really tumultuous time. And I think it's up to us to serve our veterans that are coming back with PTSD by being united. Because they're out there laying their lives on the line for us to have freedoms. And those freedoms include freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. And what they're coming home to is a country that's more divided than ever, and angrier than ever. And so that unto itself does not lead for a very peaceful return home. And I could see that. And I think that we owe it to those guys to do what we can to get along with one another. I mean, that's really the fact, because the administration isn't helping that out. The extreme left and the extreme right is not helping that out. What we're doing is we're getting more angry, we're getting more violent, we're getting more herd mentality, pack mentality, and the internet is just the worst place for anybody who's got some traumatic issues, and you're looking on there, and it's just like, if you don't agree with me, then you're a bad person, or your group is bad, or whatever. And I remember, I'm 52 years old, and I remember growing up at a time where Democrats and Republicans could have a conversation about things that they talked about and disagreed about, and then go have dinner afterwards. You know what I mean? My dad's a staunch Republican. I'm an independent. He doesn't understand my feelings and thoughts. Does he love me any less? No. So I think this, for me, it's a broader question. It's more about uniting as a country and as a people and having healing be what brings us together. If you think about the universe as we know it, 99% of it is space, 1% of it is matter. And that matter makes up all the planets, all the stars, everything on Earth, that table, and all of us. And it's all the same stuff. And on an atomic level, there's vibrations between the atoms, which are the electrons going around the nucleus. In between those things, there's space, and they vibrate all the same within everybody and everything on the planet. So ultimately, we are all each other, and we are all one. And it's up to us to be graceful to each other, to be helpful to each other, to be kind to one another. As Voltaire says, I may not agree with what you have to say, but I defend to the death your right to say it.
Amen.
So those are some pretty and there's a number of stigmas attached to mental health that I'd like to help lift, because I think that it is a great strength to find vulnerability and to reach out for help. That's really the key thing that I want to get across to people struggling who are afraid to reach out because it's shameful. We carry shame. Why can't I get along like everybody else? Why can't I just go to the supermarket and not panic? Take a friend with you, but I'm afraid to call them. I'm ashamed to call them. I don't want them to know that I'm like this. But that is the true strength, is to reveal your essence and to be who you are and carry your truth with you. And by doing so, we can help heal one another. That's what
Hello everyone, my name is Jamie Hyder. I work with a lot of veterans organizations. I'm here as a civilian, I'm not an expert, not a doctor, but I have had the opportunity as an actress to work with a lot of active duty and veteran service members. I've done 4-day embarks on aircraft carriers, flew C-2 Greyhounds, and did trap landings on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean, been on submarines, been on all kinds of things. And what I can tell you is our veterans and our armed forces, they possess nothing that any of us in this room don't possess. They're made up of everything that we're made up of. And what I can tell you is, we talked a lot about today, the things that happen when you're serving. For instance, speaking about the military and those types of trauma. And there's a lot that goes into the research and to understanding what's happening to our veterans when they're coming back. And from a civilian point of view, I think that we need to be thinking about what we can do on this end to aid in the transition. Because many of us probably think they must be so relieved to be out of Fallujah, to be out of, wherever they're serving, to be off the aircraft carrier they've been on where they haven't spoken to their family for months. And we think about what that must be like. Well, for a lot of them, coming into our world is the scary part, because now what's my relevance? What's my place? So I work a lot with the Call of Duty Endowment. Activision funds 100% of the charity's needs, so every single dollar that comes to Call of Duty Endowment goes directly towards placing veterans in high-paying, full-time, stable jobs. And when it comes to mental health, a lot of us at the organization believe that is the #1 thing that we can do on this side, is to provide them with purpose, with mission, with identity, with meaning. You are not going to find a more responsible, hardworking, disciplined, structured, organized individual than someone who has just come out of our military. So as corporations, as business people, we have to think about that. You need to think about what percentage of your workforce is coming in from the veteran population. That is something that we can do. That doesn't require money. That doesn't require education. That requires a job opening and understanding how to translate those military skills into civilian life. In addition to that, I also work with the Student Veterans of America, and they work to provide campus resources for those coming out of post-service who want to go into higher education. You're already afraid as a veteran to come back into a world that doesn't understand you or your experiences. So what is it like being a 35-year-old going to get your bachelor's degree? That is opting to voluntarily walk into another situation where you are an outsider and you're very different, let alone the experiences you're coming from. It's about the experience you're walking into. So that organization in particular has 1,500 different campus reps at 1,500 schools around the country that provide veterans and reservists with the resources they need. Let's say you're a reservist and you have an exam next week and you get called to go work. Who's going to be there to represent you on that campus to make sure you don't fail that class, because now you have to go serve your country and you can't go take your final? There's representatives on these campuses to help ease that transition. So even if you're not a member of these organizations, even if you don't have money, if you're not a doctor, it doesn't matter, because what we can do as a community, and this has come up a lot today regarding mental health in general, is our role on behalf of others in our community. And I think something that's important about that is understanding if you have a neighbor who served, if you have a family member, it could be your son or daughter, your mother, your father, it could be a coworker, it could be a colleague. You don't have to understand what they went through in order to help them feel more welcome as a result of that experience. Ask questions. What was it like? What is the food like on this base in Afghanistan? What did you do in your free time? Did you guys play volleyball? Did you play soccer? What kind of aircrafts have you been on? What kind of, what have you done as far as crafts on the water? Understanding and just asking questions, I think, really helps to minimize that gap. And simply just the experience I've had, which I've been lucky to have, which I understand is unique. I have been able to go to someone who's a veteran and I see their hat and I ask them what they did. And just because I can ask a few educated questions, it makes that person feel so much less alienated in their experience. So even if you can't understand or totally share in being there with that person, I do think that we can create shared experiences by acknowledging to them, we know what you went through was different. We know it must feel really weird to actually be able to sit outside on your porch without having that acute awareness of threat, because you've just been taught for the last however many years to live in fear, to be ready. And those are not things that we deal with in civilian life, and that's what bombards a lot of the brains of the people coming back who have just served. So even if you don't totally understand maybe some of the things we talked about today, even if you don't have a personal experience, or maybe even a close family member who's been in, you probably have a neighbor. You probably have someone who works at somewhere near your grocery store, or works in a major corporation. Just ask them questions. Because it's one thing to come back and have everyone say thank you for your service, and it's a whole lot different to have someone say that and actually understand what your service was. So I think as civilians and as a community, that is something that's within all of our power. Ask questions, understand that it's going to be something that you might not understand, and that's totally fine. But do the work so that we as a community can provide a more welcoming environment, so that they don't only have doctors and these organizations, they can come to their neighbor and be able to share those experiences. So I think that's something that we can do as corporations, as individuals, is simply reminding our veterans that they have a place in civilian life, because we have a relationship with our doctors, and we say thank you for taking care of our health. We have a relationship with the person who fixes the leak in our roof. Thank you for providing me with shelter. What many of us don't have is a personal relationship to those who are providing us with our safety. And oftentimes people have an issue with our military, and what I have found in spending time with these individuals is you're probably more likely to have a use with our government's use of our military. That's what your issue is, not with the individuals who don't have a choice as to where they're going and what they're doing, who their commander-in-chief is. They don't have that choice. So instead of looking at as our military or our government, we really have to look at the individuals who make up all these organizations.
I wanted to say that you're completely correct in that, and one thing that you can do is get involved with community organizations and initiatives. Right now in Los Angeles County, we're working on the Mayor's Veteran Suicide Challenge, which includes those components of just ask and be there. For people who aren't necessarily doctors, and there's a component for medical professionals to be able to ask the question, but how do you want to be there for somebody who is displaying suicidal thoughts or feelings and that type of thing. So there's that, and then also we have something called the Veteran Peer Access Network, which is coming into being, and Mimi's actually working on that for DMH. And peer support is tremendously important. Again, it's that supportive fabric of community that helps the transition. And regardless of what transition it is, all of us are transitioning every moment of every day. You know, if you think about it since birth, so.
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. In the spirit of open source and what Dave said about unifying the country, I'd like to offer up the book that I just wrote to help veterans. It's free for any veterans in need, and I lost everything when I came back in transition. I was a fighter pilot, and kind of like the gentleman up there said, I didn't get any help. I thought I could do it all by myself. And so I lost my 4 children, and it was terrible, but my mom always said growing up, the best thing you can do when you're not feeling that great is help other people. So I wrote this book, and I just want to offer it to anyone that needs it. And if anyone has any ways, I want to start a school to help veterans become part of the solution. So the veterans that are struggling today can be the mentors and leaders of tomorrow. So if you have any ideas, come talk to me.
You brought service to others, and that really is the way out, you know? I mean, self-centric thinking leads to emotional suffering. That's it. So service is the way to get out of suffering.
So I hope